Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our midweek reflection today. And I'm going to be looking at Luke's Gospel, chapter 22, verse 54 to the end. Peter disowns Jesus. Then, seizing him, they led him away and took him into the house of the high priest. Peter followed at a distance, and when some there had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter sat down with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, "This man was with him." But he denied it. "Woman, I don't know him," he said. A little later, someone else saw him and said, "You also are one of them." "Man, I am not," Peter replied. About an hour later, another asserted, "Certainly this fellow was with him, for he's a Galilean." Peter replied, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." Just as he was speaking, the cock crowed. The Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him: "Before the cock crows today, you will disown me 3 times." And he went outside and wept bitterly. Thanks be to God for his word. I want to read a little poem before I continue, and it's called "And God Said If." If you never felt pain, then how would you know that I'm a healer? If you never went through difficulty, how would you know that I'm a deliverer? If you never had a trial, how could you call yourself an overcomer? If you never felt sadness, how would you know that I'm a comforter? If you never made a mistake, how would you know that I'm forgiving? If you never were in trouble, how would you know that I will come to your rescue? If you never were broken, then how would you know that I can make you whole? If you never had a problem, how would you know that I could solve them? If you never had any suffering, then how would you know what I went through? If you never went through the fire, then how would you become pure? If I gave you all things, how would you appreciate them? If I never corrected you, how would you know that I love you? If you had all power, how would you learn to depend on me? If your life was perfect, then what would you need me for? It's great, isn't it? If your life was perfect, what would you need me for? You know, it's very easy for us to judge other people and to judge Peter in this story for his failure here. But within this story, we have the hope of restoration. Failure doesn't have to be the last word. It's simply an event along life's journey. And let's be honest, we've all failed God at times, haven't we? But the story of Peter proves that failure doesn't always mean we have blown it. It just means we have some lessons still to learn. It doesn't mean that we're a permanent loser. It just means that we're not as smart as perhaps we thought we were. It doesn't mean that we should give up. It means we need God to show us the next step, perhaps. And it doesn't mean that God has abandoned us at all. It just means we need to know God's plan for our lives. You know, when we've failed, especially when we've failed those we love the most, we can feel a whole range of emotions, can't we? Embarrassment, anger, fear, shame, despair. We can feel dirty and unworthy because we acted so foolishly. When we've hurt someone deeply, we want to know if they still love us, or have we blown everything? Will they ever forgive me? Can I ever forgive myself? And often that's the hardest. Can we forgive ourselves when we've messed up? I'm sure that Peter never ever forgot what happened when he denied Christ. But fortunately, his failure is not the end of the story, because later on we see how Jesus restores him. We see that his failure actually had an effect. It separated Peter from the other disciples. When we read the story about the empty tomb, we see the angel instructed the women at the tomb to go and tell the disciples and Peter the good news. Now, perhaps that shows us that Peter was not with the other disciples at that point. It shows us that sin separates us from God and from God's people. Sin isolates us. We hide. And the devil tries to convince us that having made such a stupid mistake, that no one would want to be around us ever again. The Bible tells us, though, that Jesus is the lifter of our heads. When we fail publicly, all we want to do is hide, isn't it? Hide from others. But though Peter may have failed Jesus, Jesus still sent for him. Jesus doesn't write Peter off as a permanent failure. Jesus still has plans for Peter's life, plans to give him a hope and a future, plans to give him a second chance. In 1 Corinthians 15, we read that Jesus was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. Isn't that wonderful? It seems then that Jesus met with Peter before he met with the rest of the disciples. What amazing grace! Jesus doesn't wait for Peter to make the first move. He comes to him resurrected straight from the grave. But more amazing still is the way in which Jesus restores Peter publicly. Peter had publicly denied Jesus, therefore it's only fitting and he needs to be restored publicly. After a night of catching no fish, all the disciples felt that they had failed as fishermen, failed to catch any fish. But in the morning, Jesus told them to cast their nets again, and they then catch an enormous load. See, sometimes the Lord allows us to fail in our own strength so that we may learn that only by his power will we ever succeed. And it's then that we see this amazing restoration. Peter and Jesus have a conversation around a coal fire. And that in itself is amazing, because being around one fire in the courtyard, Peter says, I don't know him. And around another fire on the beach, he says, Lord, you know that I love you. Around one coal fire in the courtyard, Peter denied Christ. Around another coal fire on the beach, he is restored by Christ. 3 times Peter denied Jesus, didn't he? And 3 times Jesus asks Peter if he loves him. You see, the other disciples needed to hear Peter openly declare his love for Christ. Without hearing those words, the other disciples would continue to have doubts about Peter's faithfulness and commitment. As painful as this was for Peter, it was absolutely necessary. Because here Jesus is cleaning the wound so that it might be properly healed. He's getting rid of Peter's guilt and shame by dealing with it openly. Jesus doesn't try to make Peter feel guilty. He doesn't humiliate him publicly. He doesn't ask him, are you sorry for what you did? He doesn't make him promise to do better. He just asks one question. Do you love me? You know, once we've hurt someone we love, it is very hard to look them in the face. And it is harder still to be questioned about our true commitment towards them. How could you have done that? What were you thinking? Do you even love me at all? Did you ever love me? But the questions must be asked, and the answers must be given, and they must be repeated if the truth is to be fully told. I think Peter needed to see the enormity of his sin, and he needed to hear Jesus ask those searching questions, because only then could he grasp the magnitude of Christ's forgiveness. Only then could he be truly restored. Without the pain, Peter would not get better. We often try to hide things, sweep them under the carpet and carry on with our lives, but it can't be done. We don't get better because we don't want to face the hard truth about what we've said and done. But until we face the truth about ourselves, we can never be free. When Christ asks the question the third time, Peter's heart is broken and his self-confidence flies out the window. See, Peter thought he knew himself, but he didn't. Now he's not so sure. Now he doesn't even trust his own heart. Instead, he trusts in the Lord who knows all things. And that is a mighty step forward in Christian growth. Sometimes, you see, we have to hit rock bottom before we can say those words. Now the old Peter was gone forever, and a new man was born when Jesus restored him. What does Christ do with failure? He redeems it. God is able to forgive all of our past. So why can't we? God says that he's removed our sin from us as far as the east is from the west. You can't get further than that. For all of us, the process of Christian growth is long and painful, with many ups and downs. Peter the Rock often seemed to be very unrock-like, didn't he? It took repeated failure to produce rock-solid character in him. But Jesus never gave up on him. And I'm so pleased that Jesus has never given up on me, because I have failed him so many times. But always he restores. From beginning to end, Jesus believed in Peter more than Peter believed in himself. And that's true for all of us. As the poem said at the beginning, if your life was perfect, then what would you need Jesus for? The hero in Peter's story isn't Peter. The real hero is Jesus. So when we fail, which we will do, we must put our trust in God alone and get up again, and by God's grace, carry on getting up again. If God did it for Peter, he can do it for you and for me, because that is grace. Amen. Bye for now. Have a good day, and I'll speak to you again soon.